The night split open with a scream. It wasn't the scream of anger or even fear. It was pain. Raw, blistering, unrelenting pain. Elijah Carter staggered back on the porch of his own home, his small backpack sliding from his shoulder as he clawed at his face. His eyes burned as though someone had set fire inside them, the world around him melting into blurred streaks of red and orange. He coughed, sputtered, his voice breaking into frantic gasps. "I can't see! I can't! Please!" The crowd that had gathered across the street froze. People clutched their chests, some with phones raised in trembling hands, filming as if they could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Standing just a few feet away was Sergeant Rick Donovan, his pepper spray canister still raised, his knuckles white around it. His jaw was tight, his stance wide, as though he had just subdued a threat. But it wasn't a threat. It was a 15-year-old boy on his own front porch, wearing sneakers and a hoodie, his backpack spilling open onto the concrete. A math workbook, a sketch pad full of half-drawn buildings, and a basketball jersey slid across the steps like scattered confessions of his innocence. Donovan's voice cut through the stunned silence. He reached for something. I followed procedure. Everyone stepped back. But no one moved. The only sound was Elijah's desperate crying and the shallow murmur of neighbors whispering, "He's just a kid. He didn't do anything. Oh my God." Then came the voice of Rosa Alvarez, Elijah's elderly neighbor, who pushed past the officer without hesitation. "Get away from him! He's a child!" She fell to her knees beside Elijah, tearing a corner from her shawl and soaking it with water from a bottle she had carried. With trembling hands, she pressed it against his swollen eyes. "Hold still, mijo. Hold still," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sergeant Donovan barked at her. "Ma'am, step away now, or I'll place you under arrest." But Rosa didn't move. Her wrinkled face twisted with anger as she stared up at him. "You should be ashamed. Ashamed." The tension was a live wire now. A crowd had grown, their phones recording, whispers morphing into shouts. "He didn't do anything. That's Daniel Carter's boy. Somebody call his father." And then, almost as if summoned by the collective cry for justice, headlights cut across the block. A sleek black SUV rolled slowly to the curb, its engine low and steady, vibrating through the tense air. The crowd parted instinctively, their breath hitching, as the driver's door opened. Chief Daniel Carter stepped out. He was a man who carried authority without trying. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp under the streetlights. But tonight, it wasn't just the badge on his chest that commanded attention. It was his eyes. Dark, stormy, unreadable, but heavy with something dangerous. Something Sergeant Donovan didn't yet realize was about to crash down on him like a tidal wave. The crowd hushed. Phones stayed raised. Elijah, still blinded and wheezing, called out in a broken voice, "Dad?" And at that moment, everyone understood. The officer hadn't just pepper-sprayed a black teenager, he had pepper-sprayed the police chief's son. And the storm was just beginning. Daniel Carter didn't move at first. He stood by his SUV, his hand still on the door, his gaze fixed on the sight before him. His only son on his knees, blinded, gasping for air, with an officer standing over him like a hunter, claiming a kill. The chief's chest rose and fell, each breath sharp, as though it had to be forced down. "Dad!" Elijah choked again, reaching blindly into the air. Rosa held him steady, whispering comforts. But her eyes darted between the boy and his father, as if unsure whether Chief Carter was about to comfort or explode. Sergeant Donovan broke the silence. His tone was clipped, defensive, but carried the arrogance of a man who had never been challenged. "Chief, I didn't know this was your son." The suspect resisted when I approached. "I followed standard protocol." Chief Carter's voice came low, dangerous, calm, in a way that made the hairs on the back of every neck in the crowd stand up. "Protocol." He stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing against the pavement. "You pepper-sprayed a child on his own porch, my son, and you're calling that protocol?" Donovan stiffened but kept his chin raised. "With respect, Chief, I saw a potential threat. The kid reached into his pocket when I—" The chief cut him off, his tone suddenly sharp, like a whip. "Did you ask for his ID? Did you speak to him before drawing? Or did you just see a black boy with his hand in his pocket and decide that was enough?" The crowd erupted in murmurs, some angry, some supportive. Cameras zoomed closer. Rosa whispered fiercely, "Don't stop, Chief. Let him hear it." Elijah coughed violently, clutching Rosa's arm. Daniel dropped to his knees then, the chief's iron facade cracking just enough to reveal a father's pain. He cupped Elijah's face gently, ignoring the officer now, whispering, "It's okay, son. I've got you. Just breathe. I'm here." The boy's skin was flushed and raw where the spray had hit. Daniel's hand trembled as he wiped his son's cheek. His jaw tightened as he looked at the burning evidence of another man's prejudice etched into Elijah's face. But Sergeant Donovan wasn't finished. He stepped forward, almost indignant. "Chief, I need you to understand. There have been reports of break-ins in this neighborhood." The boy matched the description. Hoodie, backpack, acting suspicious. Daniel's head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Donovan's. The words were quiet, but the fury beneath them was seismic. "The description of what? Someone walking home from basketball practice? Someone carrying homework?" He held up Elijah's math book from the ground. The worn cover and pencil marks seemed to scream louder than any words. Donovan faltered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I couldn't take chances. Officer safety comes first." The chief rose to his full height now, towering, his voice gaining power. "Officer safety does not mean terrorizing the innocent. It does not mean assaulting a child before a question is even asked." Elijah whimpered softly, his face pressed against his father's uniform. The sight melted some in the crowd into tears, and even hardened men lowered their cameras for a moment in reverence of the scene. Daniel's mind spiraled as he held his son. Memories came unbidden. Elijah's first steps, his first scraped knee, the boy's laughter when he dunked a basketball on a lowered rim. And now this, an image that would stain them both forever. His boy's face blistered with chemical burn, not from an enemy or criminal, but from the very institution Daniel himself had sworn to lead with honor. The chief's voice dropped low again, steady but laced with ice. "Sergeant Donovan, you've made a mistake tonight. One that won't be hidden. One that won't be excused." The crowd cheered softly, murmurs of "Yes, Chief," and "Hold him accountable," threading through the night air. But beneath their hope was fear, because everyone knew it wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system that allowed men like Donovan to act first and justify later. And in that moment, Daniel Carter wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a chief. He was a black man, standing on the knife edge between duty and rage, and the next choice he made could ignite the entire city. The sharp blue and red flashes from the patrol car painted the street like a warning siren that wouldn't end. Neighbors who had once peeked from behind curtains now stepped fully onto their porches, phones raised high. their voices swelling with every second that passed. The sound was a mix of outrage, disbelief, and anticipation, as if they knew history was unfolding before their eyes. Elijah leaned against his father's chest, his body trembling. The burn in his eyes refused to fade. Rosa dabbed gently at his face with a damp cloth someone from the crowd had handed her. Daniel held his son steady, but his own hands shook more than he wanted anyone to notice. "Dad," Elijah whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't do anything." The words pierced deeper than any blade. Daniel pressed his forehead to his son's hair, whispering, "I know, son. I know." But then, as if summoned by fate itself, more squad cars rolled into the street. Doors slammed, boots hit pavement, uniforms multiplied, their presence suffocating the air. A lieutenant emerged, Lieutenant Harris, a stocky man with graying temples, known more for his ambition than for his compassion. His eyes widened when he realized who stood in the center of the storm. "Chief Carter," Harris said quickly, his tone caught between respect and alarm. "What's going on here?" Before Daniel could answer, Sergeant Donovan stepped forward, seizing his chance to reclaim control. "Sir, I encountered a suspicious individual outside this property. He resisted, reached into his pocket." The crowd booed loudly. Someone shouted, "He's lying!" Another voice pierced above the rest, "That's the chief's son!" Harris froze, his eyes flicking from Donovan to the boy clinging to Daniel. His jaw tightened. "Is that true?" Daniel stood tall, his arm protectively around Elijah. "This officer assaulted my son, on his own doorstep, without cause, without thought. And now he's trying to justify it with half-truths." The murmurs swelled into outrage. Cameras clicked. Lights from cell phones illuminated the scene brighter than the cruiser's spotlights. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was an arena, and every second was being broadcast across social media. Harris raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd, but his eyes darted nervously. He knew what this meant: a scandal, a city on fire, and his career tied in the middle of it. "Chief, let's take this inside. We can resolve this without—" "No!" Daniel's voice thundered. The weight of decades of swallowed rage, of quiet endurance, filled every syllable. "We won't hide this. We won't resolve it in back rooms. The people will see what happened here. Tonight." The crowd erupted in cheers. Donovan's face flushed red, his pride teetering on collapse. "Chief, with respect, you're letting emotions cloud your judgment. I acted in good faith. If I'd known—" Daniel snapped his head toward him, his eyes blazing. "If you'd known he was my son, you might have hesitated. But you didn't care who he was. All you saw was a black boy in front of a house you thought he didn't belong in, and you thought that was enough." A young man in the crowd yelled, "Say it louder, Chief!" The weight of truth hung heavy in the night air. Even Harris seemed to flinch. But the rising tension wasn't just between Daniel and Donovan. Elijah stirred weakly in his father's arms, whispering, "Dad, don't let them get away with it." And suddenly, the story wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything that led up to it. Elijah Carter had always looked at his father like a giant. To him, Daniel wasn't just the police chief. He was a protector, a man who could stand tall against storms. Elijah's friends teased him about it sometimes, saying, "Your dad's the boss of the cops. That's cool." But Elijah knew better. He'd seen the late nights, the exhaustion in his father's eyes, the weight of being the first black police chief in a city where some still whispered he'd only gotten the job to satisfy politics. He'd overheard words Daniel thought his son hadn't caught. "Watch your back. They'll be waiting for you to fail." And Elijah had felt that weight too. At school, teachers sometimes looked twice when he raised his hand. On the streets, neighbors sometimes stared too long, as if questioning whether he belonged to the quiet suburban block his father had moved them into. But tonight, that quiet suburban block had turned into a stage where all the doubts, all the whispered prejudice, exploded into reality. Daniel straightened, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Lieutenant Harris, call for medical support for my son. Now." Harris hesitated, then barked an order to one of the arriving officers. Paramedics pushed through moments later, carrying supplies. They crouched by Elijah, flushing his eyes with saline. The boy gasped and whimpered, but relief began to soften his breathing. Rosa held his hand the whole time, whispering, "You're okay. You're strong." Daniel never looked away. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Donovan tried again, his voice sharp with frustration. "Chief, you're letting the crowd dictate protocol. This will only embolden them." He gestured toward the bystanders as though they were a threat rather than witnesses. The crowd hissed. Someone shouted, "We're not the enemy." Another yelled, "We are the truth." Daniel stepped closer to Donovan until their faces were inches apart. "No, what emboldens them is men like you, who think a badge is a shield for fear and prejudice." Donovan's jaw clenched, but beneath the defiance in his eyes, a flicker of doubt trembled. For the first time that night, he looked less like a man in control and more like a soldier cornered by the very war he'd ignited. But the night wasn't done escalating. As the paramedics worked, more news vans rolled up. Floodlights illuminated the scene until it was as bright as day. Reporters scrambled, their microphones thrust forward. "Chief Carter, do you believe this was racially motivated? Sergeant, do you regret your actions tonight? Is this a sign of systemic failure within the department?" Harris snapped, "No comments." But the cameras ignored him, focusing on Daniel. The chief looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, journalists, strangers who'd pulled over just to watch. He realized the truth. No press conference tomorrow would matter more than what he said now. Slowly, he raised his voice, letting it carry. "Tonight, my son, a 15-year-old boy, was assaulted on his own doorstep by an officer sworn to protect him. Not because he broke a law, not because he posed a threat, but because of the color of his skin." The crowd gasped. Phones captured every word. Donovan paled. Daniel continued, his voice swelling with controlled fury. "This is not just about one officer. This is about a system that allows assumptions to become bullets, that allows bias to become weapons. And tonight, it happened to my family. If it can happen to mine, it can happen to any of yours." The street roared with approval, chants breaking out. "Justice! Justice!" Harris tugged at his collar, his career flashing before his eyes. Donovan shifted uneasily, sweat glistening on his forehead. And Elijah, through watery eyes, stared at his father like he was witnessing something greater than a man, like he was witnessing a movement. The chants grew louder, pulsing like the heartbeat of the street itself. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The word echoed against the brick walls and glass windows of Maplewood Heights, a neighborhood unaccustomed to protests, yet now vibrating with fury. Sergeant Donovan shifted uncomfortably under the chorus. He'd faced angry crowds before, but this felt different. This wasn't a mob. This was a community, and their eyes burned with clarity. Their voices rose with unity. His excuses, his authority, seemed smaller with every chant. Lieutenant Harris tried to wave down the reporters. "Clear the area. This is an active police matter." But the cameras stayed locked, recording every second. Live streams spread across phones. In living rooms across the city, people who had been scrolling through feeds now sat up straight, watching with wide eyes. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the noise. "I know that cop. Donovan's done this before." The crowd hushed for a split second. Phones swiveled. The voice belonged to an older black man in his 60s. His frame stooped, but his presence commanding. He stepped forward, raising a trembling hand. "10 years ago, he roughed up my nephew for loitering outside a store. Same excuse, same tone. My nephew filed a complaint, but nothing came of it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another voice piped up, a young woman, tears streaking her cheeks. "He stopped me too, made me get out of my car, because he said I didn't look like I owned it. He laughed when I cried." All eyes darted back to Donovan. The sergeant's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with panic, with the awareness that the walls were closing in. Daniel Carter's chest tightened. He had heard whispers of Donovan before, filed complaints that seemed to vanish, incidents brushed off as misunderstandings. He had vowed to investigate, but bureaucracy had its ways of burying truth. And now, the buried truth clawed its way into the night, raw and undeniable. Harris hissed, "Chief, this isn't the time." But Daniel raised his hand, silencing even him. His voice rose, steady and sharp. "This is the time. For too long, voices like theirs were ignored. Complaints disappeared. Victims were silenced. But tonight, the silenced have found their voice." The crowd erupted again. "Yes! Yes!" The paramedics had finished tending to Elijah, who now leaned against Rosa with red, swollen eyes, but his spirit flickered with renewed fire. He watched his father with awe and fear. "Dad!" His voice cracked, barely audible over the chants. "Don't let them bury this. Don't let them bury me." Daniel's throat constricted. Those words weren't just his son's plea. They were the cry of every parent who feared this moment, every child who had felt its shadow. He turned back to Donovan, his voice cutting through the storm. "Sergeant, you don't just answer to me tonight. You answer to them." He gestured to the crowd, to the cameras, to the world watching live. Donovan's composure snapped. "This is madness," he barked. "You're letting a mob dictate justice. I did my job. I acted by the book." "Which book?" someone shouted from the crowd. "The one written in prejudice?" another added. Laughter and jeers thundered, but Daniel raised his hand again, quieting them. His stare bore into Donovan, heavy and unrelenting. "The book you followed isn't law. It's fear. It's bias. And it ends tonight." As if on cue, phones buzzed throughout the crowd. Notifications pinged like raindrops in a storm. A young man shouted, "It's trending! #justice! For Elijah is trending!" In living rooms, diners, subway cars across the city, people now watched the stream, their anger mounting. Tweets poured in. Unbelievable! Chief's son attacked on his own porch. If it can happen to his kid, imagine ours. This is why we march. Donovan saw it in real time. The collapse of his shield, the unraveling of his authority. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. and in a last desperate act, he pointed toward Elijah, his voice shaking. He resisted. That's all there is to it. Resisted. The crowd booed, a wave of disgust crashing over him. Elijah, though still trembling, lifted his head. His voice was small, raw, but it carried. I begged you to stop. The words silenced the block. They cut deeper than any chant, sharper than any accusation. Daniel's eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He turned to Harris. Lieutenant, you have a choice to make, right here, right now. Do you stand with justice, or do you hide behind the blue wall? Harris froze. His career, his loyalty, his conscience, all warred within him. The silence stretched like a taut wire. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Reporters jostled, recording every flicker of expression on his face. And finally, Harris exhaled. Slowly, he turned to Donovan. Sergeant, hand me your badge. The street exploded. Cheers, screams, the roar of vindication surged through the crowd. Phones shook as they captured the moment. Donovan's face twisted in disbelief, his mouth opening, but no words forming. Daniel's hand pressed against Elijah's shoulder, grounding him, steadying him. For the first time that night, Elijah let out a shaky laugh, a laugh of relief, of victory, of survival. But deep inside Daniel, he knew this wasn't over. Stripping Donovan of his badge was symbolic, yes, but the system that created him, protected him, empowered him, that beast still lived. And tonight was only the spark. The crowd's roar was deafening, a tidal wave of sound surging through Maplewood Heights. Badge down! Badge down! They chanted, fists raised in triumph. Reporters leaned forward, their microphones trembling in the chaos, capturing the moment history shifted in real time. But Sergeant Donovan stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and rage. His badge, now in Lieutenant Harris's trembling hand, glinted under the streetlight like a fallen crown. Stripped of its weight, Donovan suddenly looked smaller, not a figure of authority, but a man cornered, exposed. And then the moment twisted. With a sudden, violent motion, Donovan lunged, not at Harris, not at Daniel, but at Elijah. The crowd gasped as the disgraced sergeant's arm shot forward, his fury unleashed on the boy he had already brutalized. Rosa screamed. Elijah flinched, too weak to move fast enough. But Daniel Carter was there. Like lightning, he stepped between his son and the attack, catching Donovan's wrist mid-swing. The impact reverberated through his arm, but Daniel held firm. His eyes locked on Donovan's, and for the first time that night, there was no doubt who held power. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every bead of sweat on Donovan's brow, every vein bulging with frustration. Daniel's voice cut through the chaos, steady, sharp, and booming with authority. Enough! The word wasn't shouted. It was delivered like a verdict. Final. Unshakable. Donovan snarled, spittle flying. You're nothing without that badge. You're just another— Another what? Daniel interrupted, his tone deadly calm. His grip on Donovan's wrist tightened until the disgraced sergeant winced. Another black man you thought you could humiliate? Another family you thought you could terrorize? Another name you thought would disappear into silence? The crowd went silent, every ear straining to catch the words. Even the cameras seemed to lean in, the lenses unblinking. Daniel released Donovan's wrist with a shove that sent him staggering backward. The sergeant stumbled, caught himself, and glared, but he didn't move forward again. His power was gone. Daniel turned, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, then lifting toward the cameras that broadcasted the moment to the world. His voice deepened, carrying not just his pain, but the weight of generations. "How many times does this story repeat?" he began, his words slow, deliberate. "How many times do we see a black boy mistaken for a threat? A black girl treated as less than human? A family torn apart by the very people sworn to protect them?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Tears streamed down Rosa's face as she clutched Elijah tighter. The older man who had spoken earlier nodded, his lips trembling. Daniel pressed on, his voice rising. "Tonight, it was my son, my boy Elijah. But we all know, tomorrow, it could be yours, your brother, your sister, your child. And every time they try to write it off as resisting, every time they bury the truth beneath paperwork, excuses, and silence." The chants returned, low and building, like thunder on the horizon. "No more silence! No more silence!" Daniel's eyes burned, but he let the fire fuel him. He pointed at Donovan, who now stood trembling under the streetlight. This man thought he could hide behind a badge. But that badge is not a shield for hate. That badge is not a license to abuse. Tonight, the shield broke, and the world saw it happen. The crowd erupted, a roar of vindication that rattled windows. Reporters shouted into their microphones, narrating the moment. Daniel raised his hand, quieting the noise once again. His voice dropped lower, more intimate, as though he was speaking directly into the hearts of everyone watching at home. "I need you to remember Elijah. Remember his face. Remember his voice. Because he is every child who's been told to lower their head, to walk faster, to not speak back, just to survive. And he deserves more than survival. He deserves freedom, dignity, life." Elijah, tears streaming down his cheeks, whispered, "Dad." His voice cracked, but his eyes shone with pride. For the first time that night, he wasn't just afraid. He was seen, lifted, protected by something greater than fear. Daniel stepped closer to the cameras. His final words, carved from fury and love, thundered across the night. "The world is watching. The world is listening. And the world will not forget tonight. The question is, what will we do tomorrow?" The street exploded into chants, tears, and raised fists. Some shouted Elijah's name. Others cried openly, hugging strangers. For a moment, Maplewood Heights wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the epicenter of a reckoning. And Donovan? He stood broken, his badge gone, his mask shattered, swallowed by the roar of a people who had found their voice. The roar of the crowd carried deep into the night. But as the chants softened, something else settled over Maplewood Heights. A strange stillness, heavy yet cleansing, like the first quiet after a storm. The flashing lights of news cameras cast an electric glow across faces that were tired but alive. Voices that were hoarse but unbroken. Elijah, trembling in Rosa's arms, pressed his forehead against his mother's chest. His small hands clutched at her shirt like he never wanted to let go. But his eyes sought Daniel. And when Daniel knelt down, brushing Elijah's curls back from his damp forehead, the boy whispered, "Dad, I thought he was going to—" Daniel's throat closed. He couldn't let the word finish. Not tonight. He didn't. He won't. Because you're stronger than he'll ever be. His hand lingered on Elijah's cheek, grounding him, promising silently that nothing would ever sever that bond again. The cameras caught every second, and for once, the spotlight wasn't on violence, but love. A father's hand on his son's face, a family holding each other up. The very thing Donovan had tried to break, that love, was shining brighter than any badge, any uniform, any law. Police cars eventually rolled in, but this time, they weren't here to intimidate. Two officers stepped out, their hands not on their weapons but open, palms raised in peace. They escorted Donovan away in cuffs, his head bowed, his defiance drained. The crowd erupted once more, not in anger this time, but in vindication. For once, accountability was not a promise, but a reality. "Justice! Justice!" voices thundered as the sergeant who had terrorized his community disappeared into the back of a cruiser. Rosa collapsed into Daniel's arms, her sobs both relief and release. "It's over," she whispered. But Daniel knew, deep down, it wasn't over. Not really. That night, Maplewood Heights didn't sleep. Neighbors lit candles, lining the sidewalks with glowing points of defiance and hope. Families stood side by side, and strangers became kin. The footage of the confrontation played on every major network by morning, replayed again and again. The lunging sergeant, Daniel's unshakable stand, his words echoing like scripture. "The badge is not a license to abuse." The shield broke, and the world saw it happen. The ripple was instant. Protests reignited across the country, not just in anger, but in solidarity. People carried Elijah's name on posters, his small face painted on murals with the word "resilient" in bold letters beneath it. Schools debated the meaning of justice. Churches preached about courage. City councils faced pressure like never before. And Donovan? His downfall was swift. Investigations unearthed years of complaints buried under red tape, stories from men and women who had once been too afraid to speak. Now they had a voice and a face to rally behind. But the heart of the story wasn't Donovan. It wasn't even Daniel. It was Elijah. In the weeks that followed, Elijah healed slowly. The bruises faded, though the memory lingered. He'd wake some nights in a cold sweat, Rosa rushing in to hold him until his breathing steadied. But something else began to take root in him, a spark. He watched the news, saw his name painted on murals, heard chants of justice for Elijah, and instead of shrinking, he grew. One evening, sitting on the porch steps with his father, Elijah asked, "Dad, do you think I could be someone who makes things better?" Daniel smiled, his arm wrapping around his son's shoulders. "Elijah, you already are." The boy leaned against him, quiet for a moment before whispering, "Then I'm not scared anymore." Daniel's chest tightened, pride and pain tangled together. He kissed the top of Elijah's head, knowing that moment, those words, were the true victory. Not the handcuffs on Donovan, not the headlines, not the protests, but a child reclaiming his courage. The video ends with that image. Elijah and Daniel on the porch, bathed in golden evening light. The world outside still loud, still demanding, but their small corner wrapped in peace. And then the narrator's voice, steady, reflective, cuts in. "Maplewood Heights will remember that night forever, not just for the hatred exposed, but for the love that stood taller, for the father who shielded his son, for the boy who became a symbol of resilience, and for a community that refused to stay silent." The screen fades to black, leaving only words glowing on the screen. The world is watching. The world is listening. The world cannot forget. The question is, what will you do tomorrow? The music swells, haunting but hopeful, carrying the story into silence.